Okay, so our next speaker is Jordan Plotnek. Jordan holds a PhD in Space System Security and Resilience from the University of South Australia and a Bachelor of Engineering in Telecommunications and Electronics from Swinburne University in Melbourne. Jordan is an Australian Air Force veteran and has held senior cybersecurity positions for private and public sectors organizations internationally, specialized in risk and governance for operational technology environments. Jordan is currently space cyber research at the University of South Australia and the lead partner for critical infrastructure and Ancoram Consulting. Okay. Jordan research and professional interests are centered around space security, critical infrastructure resilience, and cyber physical connect. Thank you very much, Jordan. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Oh.
You need just
Is that coming through at all?
You just press.
I'll push it again. Testing. Can everyone hear me? Excellent. Oh,
Backward.
it's already a bit forwards. Here we go. Yeah, so basically, thank you for the introduction. It's good to see a few familiar faces in here. Yeah, so I've got an electronics engineering background, Air Force cyber warfare officer for Australia. I worked with Thales and Deloitte, and I've done a few things, but it's all centered around critical infrastructure security and aviation specifically. And so essentially, today I'm going to be presenting on my PhD research, which I completed last year. And so the final outcomes, I'll be running through that. A bit of background. I mean, I don't know if you really need the background. I think everyone here is very well aware that space systems are a critical infrastructure, whether or not it's recognized in your specific legislation. The reality is that terrestrial critical infrastructures, a lot of them rely on space systems. They're very critical to our society. It's not coming through? Is that better? Just on my chin, okay. Yeah, so long story short, I think everyone's very well aware that space systems resilience is needed now more than ever. And CYSAT was a very strong moment in history that really changed the course. And I think a lot of us are here today probably because of those events, and it's really come onto the main stage. So. But the fundamental question, and I noticed this when I was in industry, when I was in the military, the word resilience gets thrown around a lot. We have resilient systems, we want to be resilient, the future is in resilience, but I could never actually figure out what that meant. I looked into it, there wasn't really very clear definitions, there's no framework, there was no way to assess resilience, and so pretty much that was the fundamental question behind my research, and I spent 4 years trying to answer that. And I'm going to try to summarize that in 30 minutes today. So we ran a 4-year study. In reality, once I started looking into it and trying to answer resilience, I realized that the same problems exist for security, and I had to have an understanding of what space systems security means before I could understand what space systems resilience means. And the more I dug, the less I found. So I really had to. We started from scratch, really, and so some of the outcomes here. I did a full evaluation of existing literature, trying to find answers to my questions. Couldn't find many, so came up with a definition for space system security, mapped the space security knowledge domain, came up with a resilience taxonomy, and then a definition for resilience, a resilience model, and then finally the ability to actually assess resilience in a space system. So I'll be trying to run through this today. Obviously, there's going to be a little bit light on some of these things, but I'm going to focus on the resilience assessment framework. Methodology, just to give you an understanding of how we got to these answers that I'll be showing you. So the first step was really trying to figure out where we start. So I looked at tangential critical infrastructure resilience literature, primarily from electrical systems, because there's a fair amount of research on that, and then tried to contextualize it with a preliminary framework and to the space environment. So then after that, I proposed this to, originally had around 60 experts. Throughout the process, it got down to 24. Which is why I've got the little plus there. And the process was I presented my framework, I got feedback from them, incorporated it, sent it back, went back and forth, until we came to complete consensus among all the experts. And to just define what a space security expert is, I looked at people with 7 years of experience in space and security. So as you can imagine, that was quite difficult to find. Took about a year just to find those people. I very much wish I had come here first. It would have been great. After that, got the final framework that everyone agreed on, brought it into a expert focus group where we had open discussion, open feedback to try to get around anything that may have sort of snuck through the cyclical process. The fourth step, we tested it on some real space systems. So I interviewed some different space companies. I looked at the ground station, launch pad mission control system, and the space vehicle itself. And I applied quite an extreme cyber model using terrorism, cyber physical terrorism. It may not be very likely, but it was a nice model to test the framework because the goal is maximum damage. And then finally consolidate the findings, come up with something hopefully useful for industry and academia, and move forwards from there. All right, let's get into the basics before I can get into the resilience. So we'll go through space system security. What does that mean? When I started looking into it, a lot of the space security definitions were very related to the Cold War. That they, from the first space race, they were very politically oriented. But Mayans broke space security domain down into 3 different areas, which was quite useful. So the first one is security in space, which I refer to as space system security, and that's where my research really focused. Space for security, so military satellites and Earth observation. And the third one, security from space, is protecting against like asteroids or aliens, that kind of stuff. So we're going to focus on the first one, security in space, security for the space systems itself. This definition is the final outcome. So I started off with the standard CIA model, it's confidentiality, integrity, availability, and then tried to apply it. As we went through the process, it sort of came out that wasn't exactly fit for purpose, and the crux of it came down to the assurance of the services, control, and confidentiality of the space system. So yeah, that was interesting. And that also includes all the ground communications, space components, people, data, processes, and supply chains. So trying to encompass the entire system from end to end, but also including the governance and everything throughout it. And the domain, just to give a bit of overview so we're all on the same page, this probably isn't anything new, but you've got your ground components, your space components, C3, which I'll get into a little bit later, may be a little bit different than what you're thinking, human segment and the governance segment. So the detail is here. It was actually quite challenging to really try to encompass the entire security domain. What is space system security? And this is the final outcome, we've tried to make it as comprehensive as possible. So I'll start with the segments along the top. I think everyone's pretty familiar with ground and space. C3 here means command and control and communications. It doesn't include cyber and intelligence and other things like that for many reasons, which I don't really have time to get into, but you can see cyber is represented along the side. Actually 2 findings, which I wasn't expecting to find, but you've got the human segment and the governance segment in there. So the human segment kind of came out because when we're thinking about security, a huge problem in security is things like insider threat and being able to understand the security impacts introduced by humans, even non-maliciously. So misconfiguration, for example. The governance segment is the other one. So governance includes all the processes and procedures, the legal and regulatory frameworks that surround it. And essentially you can kind of think of it, you've got governance is a big circle that controls the humans inside, which control your ground, your space, and then your C3, which connects the two. And really, if you've got vulnerabilities in your governance, it flows down the chain, and you end up with vulnerabilities in your actual infrastructure. And along the side here are the threats. So when we started, I used the CSIS threat assessment, the annual threat assessment that comes out. Some of you may be familiar with it. However, that was quite it didn't really work as a taxonomy because there was a lot of crossover between some of the more detailed components that they really split it out in that threat assessment. So in the end, we had to take a higher level approach, and it broke it down into 4 key categories, which any space system may face. So you've got your non-malicious threats. That includes misconfiguration, like I said, but it can also include space debris and solar flares, other things like that. You've got your cyber aspect, which we're all here for, so I won't go into that too much. You've got your electromagnetic threats. This includes things like electromagnetic pulse, jamming, also lasers, and other things like that, anything on the EM spectrum. And then finally, your kinetic threats. So kinetic includes ASAT, missiles, but it also includes on the ground things as simple as theft or break-ins, maybe a hold-up, depending on how sensitive your operations are. You may face some of those kinds of threats. And then altogether, again, this isn't the main feature, so if you want to talk to me, I can talk about this. I could probably do another 30-minute presentation on this, but the idea is that this is the entire domain. So everything that we're doing, if you're working in space security, you should fit somewhere in there. If you don't, let me know, because that would be a great finding, and I can update it. But I feel like it's high level enough that everyone sort of fits somewhere in there. And it can also be used as a way to communicate risk and communicate vulnerability, which I'll get into a bit later. Let's check I'm on time. Yes. Okay, so what is space resilience? This is the question that we're all waiting for. Let's start with the taxonomy. So there's 6 different things, and I'm going to get into this in more detail, so don't worry if you don't quite get it just yet, but I want to present the definitions first. So the ability to anticipate, which is to maintain situational awareness and proactively detect potential threats. The ability to react to those threats, so avoid, deter, or neutralize detected threats and respond to adverse events. This one was actually kind of interesting because in the space domain, especially in military space domain, there's potentially more options to react to a threat than you have in other critical infrastructure sectors. You may be able to actually offensively, conduct some offensive defense here. You've got your ability to survive, which is to mitigate, absorb, or withstand the impacts of an adverse event. And then to sustain, so regain control, preserve core functions and services in a degraded state. Recover, this is the bounce back. Often when people describe resilience, they describe it as bouncing back from an adversity, but that's actually just one component. And from my research, it's actually not even the most important component of resilience, because you need to be able to bounce back from something. So you need to be able to actually sustain your core operations in a degraded state before you can bounce back. And that's something that can be overlooked sometimes. And then finally, adaptation, which is your ability to evolve based on threat intelligence, based on lessons learned from past attacks, whether on your infrastructure or others. That was a bit dry, so I've tried to put it into a picture. I'm not sure if it makes it any less dry, but hopefully it breaks up the understanding. So essentially the definition of resilience that we came to is the ability of a space system, including its services, subcomponents, and supporting functions, so everything's included in here, to anticipate, react to, survive, recover from, and adapt to adverse events. This is the taxonomy on the previous page. And then the final one, which is really a key component that came out, is whilst maintaining control and sustaining core operations and services in a degraded state. And that's really a fundamental component of resilience, is you have to be able to continue to do what you need to do in a degraded state. So just to give kind of a high-level understanding between the two, because there was a lot of words we just went through. Security is about assurance, while resilience is about sustaining your core operations, especially in a degraded state, and the ability to do that. So what does this look like? Well, if you're a resilient system, you should be able to infinitely go through this loop. If you don't have a resilient system, the loop's going to get broken at some point, and you won't be able to continue. And this is this is a phasal model. I've got a time one on the next slide, but to give you an understanding of the process, you have to be able to anticipate. So you're constantly watching, you're aware of what's coming, so that you can detect the threat. That first little arrow going down. Once you detect the threat, you've got a window to be able to react. And if your react function is effective, you may be able to contain the threat and you sort of bypass the loop and then you continue just at the top. Otherwise, you have an adverse impact and then you're kicked into survive mode. In survival mode, you're still under impact from whatever your adverse event is. For us, a cyber attack, you may still directly be under attack. You have to be able to withstand that in that moment. And then once you've been able to contain the threat, so you know that you're able to separate yourself from being directly under attack still, you need to be able to sustain your core operations. And I can't emphasize that enough. You're going to keep hearing me say that. Your sustainment, you can stabilize your system, you can go back into recover mode, you restore your functionality, and then finally your adaptation. You need to harden your system. You need to improve so that you're more resilient again for whatever is coming next based on any new TTPs that you've identified, anything like that. I think it's a little bit easier to understand like this. Just giving you a moment to make the connections. So at T0 here, the threat's detected. You've identified, so you anticipate functions along the bottom, but you've identified a threat. So you've got that window of time to react before any impact, potentially. And then if that is ineffective, then you go through the little dip. You go into survive. That's as your system is being degraded. That's your survival phase. Once you're able to contain that threat, you can see there's a stabilization there, which is your sustainment. Your system functionality may drop, but the main thing is that you're still maintaining your core operations. So you're retaining that control over the satellite system or the space system, whatever it is, and you're able to deliver those critical services. If you've got military clients or if you've got critical infrastructure clients, some of those services will be life critical, and it's very important that is able to be sustained even during and after attack. Then you've got your bounce back, your recover, and your adaptation, which is the final step to bring your resilience back up to scratch based on the new knowledge that you've got. And the anticipate function you can see is at the bottom here. The reason why that's there is there are some models that put this kind of function at the start, and that's not a good idea because you might identify the threat, something happens, you have an adverse impact, you put all your incident response resources there, and then meanwhile it's just a decoy, they're coming from the side, and then you're really screwed. So the anticipate function, it needs to be continuous, even while you're under attack, even while you're degraded functionality. You need to be able to continuously monitor, continuously understand what's on the horizon, and keep moving forwards. So yeah, feel free to take photos or whatever. I think this is a useful tool for just understanding where your system might sit. All right, let's go to the fun stuff. How do we actually assess it? So all of that's really cool, whatever, but what does it mean? What does it mean for me as a business or as a government operator? Or even as a researcher, what do we do? So we tested it. We tested this on 3 real-world systems. I interviewed the security managers of several systems, including ground station, launch pad mission control, and satellite vehicle. There's a huge amount of data that came out of that, so I'm not going to run through the specifics, but I'll show you the process. And if you're interested in any of the particular case studies and how they fared and what it looked like, I'm more than happy to chat about that too. So, you recognize this. I went in and I essentially used it as almost an audit model. So I went in and as I was interviewing them, I said, what are you doing in this segment? What are you doing in this? What are you doing in this? And we filled out the table with all of the security controls that are being applied in that system. And honestly, it gave like almost an immediate understanding of where you might fail in your resilience cycle, because, for example, you fill it out, and often the space segment column there is pretty blank. So you can just visually see straight away that you've got some decent security controls around, and then you can see where your gaps are. Not all of these are directly relevant to everyone. Some of the electromagnetic and kinetic stuff is probably more applicable to military systems, but as we've seen in the Ukraine war, a military system isn't necessarily clear-cut. You may be part of the chain, and you're still going to be facing some pretty advanced threats. Anyway, these were pretty empty for most of them. Either way, this gives you a foundational understanding of where you sit, where your gaps are, and then you take it to the next step, which is modeling the threat. And this is really important because resilience is threat specific. I feel like this isn't necessarily understood because people will market themselves as having resilient systems, but what are you resilient to? You might be resilient to a solar flare or an electromagnetic attack, but you may not be resilient to cyber. They're very different. You have very different security controls. And so when you're assessing resilience, you have to have a threat model in mind. We use the cyber kill chain, but it's designed to be agnostic to threat models, so you should be able to apply Sparta or any of the other ones. Even non-cyber threat models should work. Again, if you try any of this, do let me know, because it's always cool to see where the gaps are, if there are any. What we did was we modeled it to each of the stages, and then we stepped through the attack step by step, modeled it against each of the security controls in place. Where there are vulnerabilities, we thought, for example, this was the cyber terrorist attack. So if I was a cyber terrorist, what am I able to do here? I can see these security controls. There are these gaps. If I go that way, then what am I able to achieve? And we just stepped through until we caused maximum impact possible in a theoretical model. And then we evaluated the system response. So this is the part that you really get an understanding of your resilience. So essentially we simulated the event. As you saw on the previous slide, we mapped it to the different phases of the resilience cycle. And so we had an understanding of what this curve sort of looked like for each system. And in fact, if they were able to complete the cycle or not. Spoiler alert, two of them weren't able to complete the cycle. The ground station was probably the best, and it's probably because it relies a lot on more traditional methods of security, so they had a better understanding of how to implement it appropriately. But yeah, we put it into boxes. It's very detailed, so I won't go into it, but essentially there was the 4 stages that we broke it down into, and we had the threat actions, the resilience function, and then we go to the next stage, the instigation, the adverse event, and then the remediation. So after the event, have you got business continuity? Have you got disaster recovery? What are you doing after your event? How are you continuing to operate? And then finally is enhancing your resilience. So you've identified how your system goes through the model. You can see where your weaknesses are. You've pretty much got a visual representation from that table, and then you can present that to whoever is the one that gives you the money to do things to fix it, and hopefully be able to implement some better countermeasures. And then finally, the risk assessment, I think, is a very important part. So you don't need to be resilient to everything 100%. It's not possible. It's very expensive I think someone else said security is a process, so you can never achieve it. But you need to understand what your risks are and invest appropriately so that you've got an appropriate level of resilience for the criticality of the systems that you operate. And one thing which is actually really important, and I feel like it also gets overlooked, but in a lot of the research from other critical infrastructure sectors, resilience should not just be limited to your engineering system, but if you are a critical infrastructure, you have a societal impact. That's the whole point. So that needs to come into factor as well, because it's very easy to get stuck in the engineering mindset, but you forget why we're doing this. Like, there's lives at stake. Planes can get grounded. Systems the GPS of guided munitions might be altered. So that needs to be taken into account when you're assessing your resilience. And I think that's about it. Yes. If you've got any questions, I'll be out on the stall. But also add me on LinkedIn. I'm going to post the whole thesis. If you've got the time to flick through, I'm going to post it on LinkedIn after this. So yeah, feel free. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jordan, for the presentation. I don't have any online question. Hopefully, in the room we will get some. Yes.
Thank you, very interesting. Is your thesis on the assessment framework for resilience available freely for reading online?
Yes, it is. It's on ResearchGate. You can search my name. I'm the only Jordan Plotnek in the world that I'm aware of, so it should come up. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So you can see Jordan around. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.